Welcome to the debate. Today, we're confronting one of the most fundamental questions in modern political economy, the rigorous academic comparison of capitalism and socialism. Our entire discussion is framed by the analysis in the source material, which, it dedicated hundreds of pages to exploring not just the theories, but the measurable real-world consequences on human existence. So the central tension we have to address is this. Which system offers a superior framework for maximizing these interconnected goals of individual freedom, social justice, and overall quality of life across a person's entire productive lifetime? I'm going to argue that capitalism, specifically through its mechanisms of, decentralized decision-making and property rights, provides the strongest foundation for individual well-being and long-term progress.
And I'm going to come at it from a completely different angle. I will demonstrate that while capitalism absolutely promises freedom, its inherent structure creates such profound systemic inequality that it ultimately limits the trajectory and quality of life for the vast majority. I think socialism, by prioritizing social justice and guaranteeing equitable access to crucial resources, offers a more resilient, dignified, and ultimately superior quality of life. The material really compels us to look beyond just theoretical liberty and focus on lived experience.
My position really rests on the foundational principle that the defense of private property isn't just an economic concern. It is fundamentally intertwined with individual liberty. It's the necessary condition for realizing human dignity. When an individual has that guaranteed economic autonomy, the freedom to own assets, to invest capital, to make high-stakes financial decisions without seeking state pre-approval, that individual is empowered to control their own destiny. That freedom is what creates the greatest opportunity for positive influence across a generation. We saw clear evidence in the source material that markets operating under these principles consistently showed a capacity for generating, unparalleled wealth and driving technological innovation. The material indicated that even factoring in population growth, GDP per capita rose by an average of 45% more in market-driven systems compared to centrally planned economies over the measured 5-decade period. That verifiable exponential growth raises the overall economic tide, elevating the baseline quality of life far more effectively than any top-down distribution system.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the promise of economic liberty automatically translates into universal dignity. The material rigorously highlights the severe inequality in access to resources and opportunities, a disparity so stark it renders the capitalist definition of freedom, meaningless for huge segments of the population. What is the value of the freedom to invest if you are trapped in cycles of debt or low-wage employment with no surplus capital? When access to basic, essential goods, healthcare, education, stable housing is contingent upon market success, human dignity is fundamentally compromised. It's subject to market volatility. Socialism, on the other hand, it focuses on a framework of collective welfare. By prioritizing equitable distribution of essential resources, it actively mitigates those deep risks and inherent contradictions of a purely market-driven system. It ensures a more stable, less precarious existence focused on meeting fundamental human needs, rather than just maximizing profit for an ownership class. So let's delve into that relationship between property and liberty, because this is really where the core tension lies. You assert that private property is the ultimate guarantor of individual liberty. But the source material's analysis of ownership concentration shows a clear problem. If the means of production, the factories, the land, the critical infrastructure, are overwhelmingly concentrated in the hands of a small percentage of the population, doesn't that structure inevitably create rigid economic stratification? The vast majority of the population is then free only in the sense that they are free to sell their labor under, frankly, suboptimal conditions dictated by those who own the capital. That structural reality places hard restrictions on resource access, limiting the actual liberty, the capacity to choose and execute a life plan for a massive segment of the population. Their lifetime development is fundamentally constrained by their position in that ownership hierarchy.
Okay. While I recognize the point about stratification, and I'll acknowledge that wealth concentration is a perennial challenge within capitalist economies, the material really compels us to look at the alternative risk. The fundamental issue isn't whether inequality exists, it's whether the solution you propose, collectivizing the means of production, imposes a far greater constraint on human agency. The absence of guaranteed private property rights fundamentally undermines human dignity, and more critically, it removes the individual's capacity for long-term planning and capital accumulation. When the individual is made entirely subservient to the state, with the state controlling all productive resources, that individual's agency is effectively zero. The historical evidence we studied suggests capitalism is far better equipped to manage wealth disparity, through targeted social programs, progressive taxation, without sacrificing the core liberty that fuels all subsequent improvement and innovation. We have to distinguish between the unfairness of inequality and the tyranny inherent in state control over all economic life. And if freedom is rooted in property, then how does the psychological landscape of those two systems compare? Our material delves deeply into the mental health consequences of stability versus competition, particularly as it relates to the security of information and expression. The decentralized nature of a capitalist society with its, myriad private media outlets, competing businesses, and diverse avenues of expression inherently protects the individual from the severe centralized control of information that's often necessary in socialist frameworks to maintain systemic stability. That political and informational security, the freedom from pervasive state surveillance and messaging, the ability to challenge the dominant narrative is absolutely vital for psychological well-being over an entire lifetime.
I find that defense of informational freedom a little bit theoretical when you juxtapose it with the intense internal pressures generated by the market itself. Our material specifically analyzed mental health and social pressure, concluding that the relentless, unforgiving competitive nature mandated by capitalism imposes a crushing level of generalized anxiety across an entire working life. The individual is subject to constant economic volatility, the pressure to optimize productivity at all costs, and the inherent instability of employment. This pervasive, systemic insecurity, what the material called performance anxiety, built into the market. It damages mental health regardless of eventual economic outcomes. It's not just about poverty, it's the constant fear of slipping. The guarantee of collective safety nets and baseline needs, which the socialist approach mandates, is designed to eliminate this damaging social pressure, leading to a much more stable, resilient, and less psychologically burdensome existence for the average citizen.
But doesn't that guaranteed stability come at the extreme cost of economic dynamism? I mean, you trade anxiety for stagnation. The ability for an economy to innovate, to efficiently allocate resources, and respond to rapidly changing needs relies entirely on decentralized economic signals. That is, the price mechanism driven by individual choices. When we draw on the material's use of historical examples, specifically looking at large-scale historical attempts at pure central planning, the systemic risk shifts dramatically. It moves from the problem of market inequality to the problem of catastrophic stagnation and the failure to deliver innovation. The critiques leveled against those historical models often centered on the erosion of core economic liberties and the subsequent lack of dynamic response to change, which, ultimately led to chronic resource scarcity and long-term shortages that diminish the overall quality of life.
That is a compelling point regarding stagnation, but we also have to rigorously examine the historical risks on the capitalist side. When we analyze those same historical examples, the systemic risks and inherent contradictions of pure capitalism are just as destructive, just in a different way. I referenced inherent contradictions earlier, meaning specifically the fundamental tension between socialized production, where goods are made by millions of collaborating workers, and the private appropriation of the resulting surplus value. This historically leads to crises of overproduction and massive destructive financial instability. The source material chronicled repeated, catastrophic historical failures, the Great Depression, numerous banking and housing crises, where the system failed entirely to address basic human needs, even when technological capacity was unprecedented. You ask why basic necessities are priced out of reach, despite our ability to produce abundance? It's because the system optimizes for short-term profit capture, not equitable social utility.
but that profit optimization is the most efficient, though yes, sometimes brutal, long-term signal of social utility. I'm just not convinced by the argument that short-term optimization necessarily excludes long-term social benefit. In fact, if a firm fails to innovate or meet a genuine need, the market ruthlessly corrects that failure through competition and bankruptcy, forcing a necessary reallocation of resources. Centrally planned systems eliminate that ruthless, necessary corrective mechanism. They hide inefficiency, which leads to the long-term systemic rot we observed in certain command economies, where the government just kept funding failing sectors for political stability, not economic efficiency. The source material showed that while capitalist crises are sharp and painful, the recovery time and subsequent technological leap often surpass the sluggish, decades-long deterioration characteristic of centrally planned systems.
You focus on the technological leap, but the social cost of those sharp, painful capitalist crises is often measured in destroyed family wealth, lost homes, and severe societal dislocation that permanently scars individual trajectories. A recovery only benefits those who survive the crash intact. The socialist philosophy, precisely because it seeks to minimize dependence on volatile market signals for essential goods, offers greater structural resilience against these macro failures. It acknowledges that human welfare should not be treated as a commodity subject to the irrational exuberance or panic of financial markets. The material forces us to recognize that while capitalism generates technological disparity and wealth disparity, it also generates the crises that require constant, expensive intervention. Socialism, by design, seeks to minimize those profound social failures from the outset, guaranteeing a baseline of stability.
Look, ultimately, the source material explores potential solutions and acknowledges problems within the logics we're both defending. Capitalism requires careful oversight. It requires regulatory mechanisms, checks and balances. But its core principle, individual economic freedom and agency, is the only reliable engine that creates the wealth and resources necessary for a society to address its challenges effectively. The freedom to plan one's own life, to manage risk, and to build personal wealth over a lifetime fundamentally offers the superior outcome, provided the state fulfills its necessary regulatory function without extinguishing that economic engine.
And I continue to disagree that the individual trajectory is superior when it is built upon a system requiring the systemic exclusion and precarious existence of others. A high quality of life must be resilient and widely accessible. The socialist model, through its determined focus on social justice and resource equality, offers a more resilient and dignified path. By protecting individuals from the most profound systemic failures of the market and minimizing the debilitating pressure of constant, existential competition, it ensures that basic human needs are met as a right, leading to a more secure and, for the vast majority, a demonstrably higher quality of life.
In summary, despite the acknowledged flaws of wealth disparity, the capitalist model offers the superior framework because it is built on agency and innovation. Economic and political freedom remains the primary, indispensable driver of quality of life across a lifetime, giving the individual maximum opportunity for self-determination and material betterment.
And to reiterate, the socialist model prioritizes dignity through stability and security. By focusing on resource equality and mitigating market volatility, it ensures that fundamental human needs are prioritized over profit, resulting in a more humane and durable quality of life for society as a whole.
The comparison really forces us to weigh those fundamental and often conflicting values: freedom, social justice, innovation, and human dignity, and seriously consider which combination truly maximizes human potential across a generation.
The evidence is complex. It shows clear benefits and inherent risks in both systems. The decision of which systemic framework best supports a prosperous and meaningful life rests, as always, with the listener.